first of all, I would like to give you an accurate idea of an author's work. Picture the scene. You have here, you have the word processor with the black and white screen. Here you have the much more expensive computer with the big colour screen, on which is loaded a game called Wing Commander. As recommended to me by Mr. J. Cornell when I was, and so one works like this. Ah, shit! Jerry Cornell feels like that all the time. And in fact, I got all the games in one go. I play them all. It's not an it's not just a shoot 'em up. These are games with a plot. And you have to work your way through to the very end to find out what's going to happen. And you keep dying. It takes weeks and weeks to play. And I had to persuade my accountant that I was buying the special colour screen, 6 megabytes of memory and a sound card for word processing. Right. There are 3 questions people often ask me. One is, where do I get my ideas from? When am I going to publish a map of the disk? And have I ever dabbled in magic? So I'll give you the definitive answers. Who knows where ideas come from? You sit there, you work, you play Wing Commander an awful lot, which is a very good way of doing it. But I suppose they mainly come because I am always working on a book. When I used to have a full-time job, I wrote 400 words every day. Every day that went past, 400 words had to be written. That meant if I was away, on holiday or whatever, I'd have to write fast before I went and catch up when I came back. I wrote a little program for my computer which kept track of the word count and told me how I was doing. I didn't write it properly. It was supposed to tell me whether I was keeping up with the average, but because I'm not a very good programmer, I wrote a program that made it impossible for me ever to do more than average. So I wasn't counting the words. Every night I go, you know, it's 11 o'clock, or about up to average. I've done thousands of words, about average. So I was doing 7, 8, 1,000. So novels were actually getting written. But the important thing is, you know that ideas are attracted to a hard-working writer in the same way that sharks are attracted to someone who splashes around in the water. I got so wound up about keeping up the word count that I finished Equal Rights. I don't know what it was published as over here, so I don't think the pun would actually work in German. What was it? Had it been published yet? Yes. Right. And that only took 150 words to do that evening, so I started Mort there and then. The pause between the finishing of one novel and the beginning of the next was about 5 minutes. I actually had an idea about Mort anyway. I mean, I knew what it was going to be. But the single motor of my work is you don't stop writing. You never stop writing. You don't take a day off to think about things. If ideas flag because you don't know what happens next, you have another game of Wing Commander or something, and then you press on because it's the only way you're going to find out is by writing and reading what you write, you never stop, and you never, ever put it on one side and come back to it later, because by then it's dead meat, and you'll never be able to do anything with it. Now, this is an absolute recipe for turning out rubbish. I throw away a lot of stuff. I've recently thrown away 50,000 words, which, give a little bit of effort, that could have been turned into a novel. It was a Discours book, and it never flew. Writing a book is like hang gliding. You run down the hill and you're holding this big piece of metal and canvas or nylon or whatever, and it's heavy. If you run fast enough, the wind takes it and then it begins to carry you. And I never reached that point where it was actually flying. I was constantly working on it the whole time. For all I know, it might be good. But it just didn't work, and so I threw it away. Because, I mean, there were plenty of usable stuff in it. There's lots of punctuation, and there's some blank spaces and capital letters. It will be recycled in the word processor and used again. So, I suppose the simple fact is that if you're typing things all the time, somehow the ideas will form in your head. The most strange things can kick off ideas. I listened, now many of you have probably heard of Professor Jack Cohen, who tends to advise people like Larry Niven, and indeed Anne McCaffrey. I was talking to him one day, and I suddenly had, in a flash, saw a plot outline about gods. Why gods are like they are. And so, in fact, I'm working on a Discours book now, which is about gods and how gods live and evolve. There are millions and millions of gods in the world, and they're all very small. They're like tadpoles. Only one in every billion actually manages to get worshipped. The rest just hang around like flies in the ceiling. What gods want are believers, and it's very, very hard to get someone believing in you. And because of this, because gods are constantly struggling with one another to be the one that gets believed in, we get the gods that win, the gods that are barbaric, the gods that are authority freaks, the gods that are strong. We actually don't get the quite nice gods because we just never get to see them. And I've been working hard on this, and they plot. A plot has arisen, and it's a simple plot to do. It's causing me a lot of heartache. What happens if you have a church that is so incredibly powerful, that has such a powerful inquisition, is so in control of the country? What happens is, it's like hitting a donkey with a stick. Sooner or later, the donkey stops believing in you, and he starts believing in the stick. And what's happened is that no one in this country believes in the God anymore, but they believe in the church. Because no one believes in the God's now extremely weak. He decides to manifest himself on the disc to find out what's going on. He's so weak that the only way he can appear on the disc is as a very small tortoise. Because there is only one person left in the entire church that still believes, that really believes in the God. The God seeks him out and gives him a very simple thing to do. Make everyone believe in me again. Now, you imagine what happens to the lowliest priest who has to go to someone like the Pope and say, sorry, God has spoken to me, we're doing it all wrong. I will tell you how we're supposed to do it right. Now, immediately you have a plot, and there's also, it's a story about the church's persecution of a philosopher that's written a book called, in the pig Latin that I use on the disc, Del Chelonia Mobile, the turtle moves. The church preaches, you see, to the world is a sphere, which is a perfect shape. And that the sun, and it orbits the sun because the world is insignificant and must orbit something much more powerful. And this philosopher has written this book which says that the world is really flat and goes through space on the back of an enormous turtle. And the church is out to persecute him into the ground. I've been having a great deal of fun with that. People come up to me and they say, why can't you map us to this world? And this always depresses me because I've got a vague idea of where things are. You know, I know my way around the major land masses, and I think I could probably find my way around Ankh-Morpork. The nice thing about Ankh-Morpork is if you can't walk down the streets, at least you can walk on the river. and I'm a sucker for maps as much as the next man. If I flick through a book and I see a map in it, that attracts my attention. You know, I think, here we are, this familiar fantasy territory. Yes, there's the icy wastes in the north. Yes, there's the dotted line, which is the hero's path through the trackless desert. You know, it tells you what to expect from the book. For example, if you read a recent Larry Niven book, they have the most complicated and strange maps in them that you can imagine. I'm thinking of the orbital trees. It tells you you've just wasted, in my case, £4.99, and because you're not going to understand the orbital mechanics. I recall the magic 25 hours it took me to read The Lord of the Rings. I was 13, and I didn't realise about the big map. And I opened the book, and the big map unfolded itself. And I was like this boy opening his first copy of Playboy. And the centre and then there was the map of Dune, and I got fascinated by them. I love them all, but I've grown up. I've come to distrust maps. You don't need them. Look at the Bible. In fact, after I wrote that, I did look at the Bible and found that my copy has in fact got maps in it. But maps are fossilized imagination. Once you've done the map, the landscape has been tamed. You can't put any more cities in. And you really need the map. I prefer the uncertainty of undefined boundaries. The knowledge of over the hills is another unknown place. You can't map the unknown place and put unknown place on it, because it's bloody unknown. If I mapped the disc, it wouldn't belong to me anymore, it would belong to you. And I get very wary of authors' creations taking on any life outside the author's immediate control. I don't object to it as such. It can be very gratifying, but it leaves me with a sense of unease. I can remember the first time, years ago now, I met my first fan, who told me one of my own jokes and then laughed at it. And I felt it was very, very odd. I felt as if this person was walking around inside my head. Anyway, the Discours is a gag. I started off parodying other people, but that faded away quite early on. And people still say that I parody people, but no one can precisely point out what it is I'm parodying. You can't map a gag. If you want to enjoy the Discours, you just have to float over it and giggle at the soap bubble colours and the even thinner plots, and don't get too involved. I remember that when I sent, I think it was Equal Rights, to the publishers, it turned out that I had spelled the heroine's name wrong. The heroine's full name was spelled out 12 times. 7 times one way, 5 times the other. This very worried lady phoned me up and said, "Which way is the correct way?" And I said, "The correct way is the way it's spelled 7 times. And she said, "Are you sure?" And I said, "No." But I have some experience of printing, and I know that every time you put a correction in, another error occurs. I would much rather you only have to do 5 corrections than 7, So therefore, the majority is going to rule. And she was really shocked. She was really shocked that an author could be that cavalier, and I hope you can understand that particular idiom, could care that little, in a sense, about the name of a character. What I really cared about was as few literals, as few mistakes in the book as possible. And then someone asked me recently what the characters from Mort were doing in the next book, which was Sorcery. And I said, they weren't doing anything. They were being in another book. They are not, my characters have not got lives into which I cut a little hole and show you a bit. They exist for the books to be written. The Discworld does not exist. There is no flat world that lies through space on the back of a giant turtle. And I have to keep saying this every time I spend a day doing the fan mail. I keep saying, it's not real. It's not a real place like Pern or Middle-earth. And I intend to keep it that way. In fact, there's a firm in England that has brought out some resin cast models of Discworld characters, which are sold extremely well, and of the Discworld itself. Which is quite a large one, and they're about to do Death actually on his horse, which would be about a limited edition that high. And they held me down and said, if we're going to do the Discworld as a complete thing with the turtle and the elephants, we must know where the land masses are. So it is one map which I scribbled on the back of an envelope, and said, put lots of cloud all over it. Incidentally, a German fan recently pointed out to me that the light, well, there was something extremely weird about the light on Discworld. I have said that the Discworld is, in fact, the units of measurement don't matter very much. I've said that Discworld is 10,000 miles across. And I have stated that. I have stated in another book that light on the Discworld travels at the speed of sound. Now, that means that the sun, which travels in a parabolic orbit, goes over this world, under this world, between two elephants, and about the smallest orbital path it must tread out would be 35,000 miles long. Now, it has to get around that path in 24 hours. To do that, the sun actually has to travel at twice the speed of sound. But its light only travels at the speed of sound. So in fact, the sun is moving twice as fast as light. Now, people are really interested in this, and I'm on CompuServe, the American network, and there's one of the forums there which is chock-a-block with serious physics types who like a challenge. So I said to them, hey guys, I'm stuck with this. In fact, on the Discourse there were two types of light. There is the light, the normal light, which moves quite slowly, and there is the other light, which you have to have in order to see the light by. This is part of the physics of Discourse. There has to be some light in order to see darkness. If there was no light, you wouldn't be able to see the darkness at all. This works on Discourse, it doesn't work anywhere else. And I got these guys arguing. I said, if you're on the Discworld, given these facts and given the application of real physics, what do you see in the sky? And I got all kinds of answers. They said things like, well, that means since the sun is travelling twice as fast as its own light, it's a tachyon. And which is the same as saying magic anyway, so you can do what you like. Others, and the majority said that because of some kind of wave harmonic effects, you would see two suns going in opposite directions, which periodically would cross over. Others said there would be a ring of fire around the sky. Others said there wouldn't be any difference, except that when you see the sun there, it's really there. And this went on for about a week, and it was a lot of fun. When they'd all finished and argued it out, I said, hey guys, that's fine. Now, underneath all this is a 10,000 mile long turtle. have you got any ideas as how this could work? And, you know, they couldn't come up with one. On the whole, and I say this with extreme care, I distrust fantasy. I distrust it in the same way that I distrust religion. I distrust the state of mind that it causes. I don't have a lot of time for gods, or for the nobility of kings, and I don't have any time for strange occult jewellery, and there are no magical swords. There are no such things. All there is us. But I do believe that a sword can be, as it were, made magical, not by wizards, not by spells, not by all the runes cast on the blade, which is only going to weaken the damn thing anyway, but simply having been used very seriously for a very long time, then something may be imparted to that sword, and I've used that idea in Guards, which I think is probably the most recent one to have been translated. I think you're slightly out of order here. The reason I distrust SF, fantasy and religion, are you familiar with the term cargo cult? It tended to turn up in what used to be known as the South Seas. What would happen is that although it predates the Second World War, it reached its full ridiculous flowering then. You're a simple islander. A boat arrives full of Americans. They make a runway in the jungle. Big silver birds come, nearly in refrigerators and light bulbs and medicine and food. And then the war ends, and the Americans go away. And you think, hey, this isn't too difficult. What you do is, you make a big runway in the jungle, and you put a control tower and big silver birds all over the line. And in fact, what happened was on some islands, people would make, in the middle of the jungle, a runway, and then put a bamboo control tower and a few bamboo aircraft, in order to attract the other aircraft, like decoys. And this was the cargo cult in its late flowering. They had seen, if you like, the surface of the effect. They didn't know what was behind it. There was one island that wrote to the USA when Lyndon Johnson was president, saying, could they buy him? Because the USA was clearly a very successful country and he was its chief. So could they please buy him and he could come and be chief of their island, and then they would be a successful country like America. These were not stupid people. They just hadn't thought it all the way through. But I swear that there are lots of people in the world now that think the problems will be solved, all our problems will be solved by the aliens landing and giving us hyperdrive and pollution-free electricity and probationary membership of the Galactic Federation. SF, at least that certain kind of right-wing, gung-ho space opera that the Americans seem to be so keen on, tells us the future will be big and magnificent. I stopped reading it when even writers I respected had us going to the stars within a couple of 100 years of a major nuclear war. This tends to be the case. You find that in that little bit of background history that's given, that round about the end of this century, there's this big war, but now we're in 2150, and here's the first voyage to Sirius. Somehow we managed to scrape together enough of the molten slag that remained of our technological base and build a starship out. Much as I respect Larry Niven, his future Earth is a kind of huge Southern California. Really worries me. I've been to Southern California. Thought the whole of the Earth being like that. And a lot of fantasy tries to tell us that what we really need in the future is the past, all over again. What did the past really hold for us? Well, in my case, I would have died around the age of 25 as an old man from dental abscesses. My daughter would have been born dead. What the past had for us was ignorance, pain, superstition, and a million horrible ways to die. What matters is the here and now. And I look around now and I see about a dozen fantasy books trailing behind me. I'll particularly draw your attention to Guards, which is the one where I said what I really thought about the whole fantasy business. And in fact, I'm not attacking fantasy at all. I'm attacking a certain approach. It was brought home to me at the World Fantasy Convention, which was held in London a few years ago. Now, in England, the main fantasy conventions tend to be in the hands of people who think that fantasy writers are people like Stephen King and James Herbert. And the centerpiece of the art show, I remember, was a tasteful gibbet with dehydrated corpses hanging from it. And I didn't like that very much. That wasn't what fantasy meant to me. But then I looked at some of the other fantasy art on show, what I call the fluffy pink unicorn. Fantasy as nursery tales for adults, all soft and pastel. True fantasy isn't like that. Insofar as they've existed in human mythology, elves, dwarves, goblins, the fair folk, call them what you will, have never been good-natured or happy or particularly friendly towards humans. They've been capricious, cruel and unkind. Unicorns aren't sweet. Did you ever have, in translation over here, Alan Garner's book Elidor? A superb book, best ever description of a unicorn. Nothing sweet about it. A big, sweating stallion that used its horn as a deadly weapon. I hate that kind of twee fantasy. The sweetness of it. One of the few authors that comes close to getting it right in my mind is Rob Holstock in the Mathago Wood books. Real fantasy is harsh and cruel and messes with your mind, and that is what he tells. But I can use fantasy. The story I'm working on at the moment needs a fantasy world to happen in. But the story is real. It is about the nature of belief and the relationship between people and gods. And it's a crying shame. It's impossible to do this in any other genre. I can't talk about big, serious things, except in fantasy. I find this is quite weird. We have a special genre in the UK. It's known as serious literature. Not many people read it. It tends to be about the problems of being a middle-aged lecturer on some university campus somewhere. But you cannot deal with important things then. What's considered an important debate in the Church of England at the moment is whether or not women should be ordained. Now, this is not important. This is not an important subject for clerics to be talking about. Important subjects in religion are, does God exist and where can we get his phone number? all these other things are housekeeping. Of course women should be ordained. It doesn't matter. You should just do it. You shouldn't argue about it. It's not an important thing. The important things are the big questions up there. You should get a committee to sort out the rest, but don't forget about it. I mentioned the use of magic. I've read a lot about magic. And people do tend to sidle up to me at parties and conventions and give me various secret signs and secret handshakes to see if I'm going to reveal myself as one of the secret masters of the earth. And the simple answer is that if you've got an ear for it and several shelves of reference material, and if you've had one or two girlfriends when you were younger who used to wear black nail varnish and have that kind of white complexion that makes Morticia Adams like a lifelong drinker, these are clues and your imagination does the rest. But while I was writing this, I looked at the shelves and I thought, God, or any other deity of your choice. There's 12 foot of reference material there. There must be more to it than this. And there is, of course. I'm aware of 2 occasions where ceremonial magic has actually been used, and it appeared to work. I haven't seen them for a long time, a couple of friends who believed that they were witches. And I'm not going to argue with this. They were very poor at the time, and they wanted a car. They did a bit of magical working to achieve this using an ancient Egyptian car requirement spell. Now, he worked as an odd job man. He used to do a bit of gardening, a bit of everything. About a fortnight after the spell, he was doing some minor house repairs for an American who, as it turned out, was going back to the States. And what was one thing or another, it wasn't going to be worth his while transporting his car back with him. So in payment for the small amount of work this guy had done on his house, he gave him this car, which wasn't worth transporting to America, but was certainly worth having in England. And suddenly, for a week's work, this man had a car. 6 months later, I saw them again. How's it going, I said. Fine, they said. How's the car? Oh, we haven't got a car, they said. They said, we couldn't afford the tax and the insurance and the petrol. And I thought, this is exactly how magic works. Magic wants to trick you all the time. We know about this. We know about the 3 wishes. And you always use the 3rd wish to undo the harm that the first 2 wishes did. They thought they wanted a car. They didn't. What they needed was to be rich enough to have a car. And they hadn't made that important distinction. Magic is one of those things to which people are always disposed to extend the benefit of the doubt. Despite the fact that it's never worked before, we hope it's going to work now. When I say recently, before I used to work as a press officer for several nuclear power stations. And I remember one of the strangest occurrences in my life was the problem of the pixies who were interfering with the running of the local power stations. Pixies, I don't know what you would call them there, but the little buggers about that high and quite mischievous. See, we have a power station called Hinkley Point. In the grounds of the power station is an old burial mound, known locally as the Pixies Mound. During the course of the construction of the power station, it is said that a lorry driver accidentally reversed his lorry over the Pixies Mound, thus making the pixie very angry. Then during the course of the construction of the power station, when little things happen, like they found it was going to cost £3 billion more than they expected. Someone dropped a £14 hammer on this complicated computer case. Everyone blamed it on the pixie, and it became a joke. And when the contractors finished building the power station, they gave the station manager a garden gnome, a little plastic pixie that big, on a little stand, and they put a little plate in it, and everyone had a big laugh, and they put the pixie in a glass case on the power station. Now, magic messes with people's minds. Before long, the legend grew up that if ever the pixie was disturbed and taken out of his case, something would go wrong on the site. Let me remind you, we're talking a nuclear power station. A nuclear power station, by its very nature, is a million things nearly going wrong. That's what a reactor is. Something nearly going wrong. Now, I got involved in this when there was a huge storm. All our nuclear power stations are built on the coast. And this storm came up the channel, and the sea roared into the pump house of the power station and drowned the cooling pumps under 60 foot of water, and they had to shut all the reactors down. And the TV crews came in to film, there hadn't been any danger at all. No danger whatsoever. I was the press officer for it, and that's my job. My job was to tell you this. In fact, there wasn't any real danger. What was underwater was a load of pumps. Anyway, while they were on site, someone told the TV crew that, someone must have moved the pixies. And sure enough, it was found that because the station won some trophies or something, the pixie had been taken out of his cabinet and put in another cupboard somewhere. Right, well, we got a little piece on the local news. And it was treated as a funny item. There's a bit about the repairs going on in the power station. And they took some photos of the pixie. And it was funny. And I sat there and watched it. And I had this absolute certainty that it hadn't stopped there. That this was going to echo for forever. We started getting letters from everywhere. And it was obvious that the story, as it had been passed around the world, had grown in the telling. Now, I have to say that Germany, particularly the kind of Black Forest area, was a prime source of these letters. They often had toadstools and mushrooms. And could we please tell them give them more information about the pixies who ran the nuclear power station? Now, they all ended up on my desk, and I decided to draft a letter explaining about the charm of the belief in gremlins. You know about the belief in gremlins grew during the wars. It means explaining all those little things that go wrong. And how everyone needed, even nuclear physicists, needed a bit of magic in their lives. And I was talking about this to one of the guys on the nuclear power station site. And I said, what I'm basically saying to people is, look, no one believes it, it's just fun. And he said, what do you mean? No. And it turned out that there were quite a few people on the site that didn't exactly believe it. But on the other hand, it looks nice in its glass case. It's just best not to move it. What did, now, strangely, it's funny how the science fiction writer in you thinks. The size of the pixie's mound was a much bigger mound. Very, very impressive. And clearly not natural. I asked about this. I was told, well, it takes 10 years to build a nuclear power station. In that time, you are going to wear out equipment. And you have it, so let's say you have a bulldozer. This bulldozer has been working very hard for 5 years and it's broken down. It's worthless. We don't want that, and it weighs like a zillion tons. We can't drive it away. So they've got 2 bulldozers which are broken down, and put them in this field, and they've used some still living bulldozers to bulldoze all the earth on top of them. Now that did frighten me. You've got the road on one side, the pixie's mound. 2 buried bulldozers. I thought one night it's going to be a stormy night. And suddenly you're going to hear the roar of the diesel engine. The first ever burial mound to excavate itself. I have to say that although I'm kind of shaky about magic, I really do feel that evil exists. But I think it's become a bit shoddy, and it's moved away from where it used to be. Now, you have VAT in Germany, don't you? Value-added tax? Right. Right, well, I put the odd clue here and there in my books. Now, recently I got a letter from my VAT office, and it enclosed a form, and it said, pay considerable attention to note 3 on the back of this form. And I turned over the back of the form, and there was notes 1 and 2. And I realised that I could get modern bureaucratic state would have agreed that being a cockroach can only be an up. Beelzebub, I will tell you, is your brother compared to the kind of mind that can draft the average social services bill. Or indeed, take the EEC seriously. Armageddon will be launched not by a crazed loony with 666 tattooed on his forehead, but by some apparently human being who thinks that you can call people personnel. At least Satan values your soul. Unfortunately, now we are in the hands of people that don't believe you have one at all. I suspect also that magic has moved from its old stamping grounds as well. Did you ever have over here a little computer called the ZX81? Was it called the ZX81? Yeah. Right. Millions of them got sold in the UK, and this was being used to say that how scientifically forward and dynamic the English were, which is exactly wrong. It showed exactly the reverse. People were buying them because they were computers, and computers can do anything. They can run power stations, they can open the curtain, they can control your house. And people have been brainwashed to such an extent they thought you could type on the little ZX81, open the curtains, and the curtains would open. We really believed that, I remember buying my little ZX81 and I really believed that I got a computer there. And it had 1K of memory. I word processed on it. I bought an add-on keyboard, I bought a little printer, and I word processed on a ZX81. A bit of colour of magic was drafted on a ZX81. And it had this little printer which printed stuff out by impressing it on a kind of on paper with aluminium foil on it. That's right, yes. Right. And they used to be hooked up the whole time, and because ZX81s were not well made, occasionally they used to throw a wobbler. And it was not uncommon to come home at the end of the day to find that the printer had started up and used a whole roll of aluminium-coated paper, which meant that the air in the room was a pale grey colour. and all the house plants had died. I go to computer shows, and I always get extremely worried. There's something now called computer-aided design. And what this means is, you spend something like 100,000 marks turning someone into a very, very bad draftsman. And look at all the adverts for computer-aided design, and they always have one thing or the other. If you look at the adverts for computers, there's three different types. There's three screen images that are always there. One is the baboon's face. I always think the baboon's arse would be far more colourful. Then there is a wireframe drawing of the space shuttle. But the one we often see is a wireframe drawing of St. Paul's Cathedral. And I keep on to say, hey guys, it's already been built. I always think they think this is St. Paul's Cathedral version 1.1. It's got all the bugs out. But anyway, I got the ZX81s and I got the Spectrum, which was like communicating with the dead, like having dead. Then Mr. Alan Sugar brought out the Amstrad computers, which were actually quite good. And then I suddenly found out I wanted more. I wanted to have a thesaurus, I wanted a spell checker, I wanted bigger memories and bigger disk drive. And I realised I was doing this because it was magic. It was like putting out a bowl of milk to get the gnomes to come and do the washing up. If I had a big enough computer, everything would be better. And actually, I could really play Wing Commander. And I could feel myself thinking, if I spend enough money, all I will have to do is sit there and just feed the paper into the computer. And so, in fact, it was really great recently to get my hands on this, made by those lovely Atari people. It's a computer, and it's so dinky that you can't do anything with it. You can't play any games. Wing Commander on this just doesn't work. There's some sod that's actually put Tetris on this. All I can do is write. There is nothing else you can do with it. It sits there and just write on me. I've actually found that well, yes, I use a spreadsheet, to work out how much writing I've done. I've actually found that I do more writing on that. I've actually got myself so techno that I say, right, you've got to have this, it's absolutely necessary, but we'll have this little computer here for actually doing the writing on. And then we go back and we can do all that, we can do all the serious stuff, like, as I say, completing special missions too on Wing Commander, which should never have been shown to me. Like I say, Jerry Cornell actually thought I was writing too many books and said, just watch this. 3 weeks have gone by and I can just hear the music and I can hear the explosions the whole time. Anyway, that's it. This is an insight into the workings of what might loosely be called an author's mind, because an author who spends an awful lot of his time, it seems to me, avoiding the actual physical act of writing. This is something you do very much at the end of the day when everything else has been done and the fan mail has been answered and all the business of being a writer, which can really take over your life, has been done. And with about 12 minutes left before my hour is up, I will say there must be some people out there with questions. Let's forego the 5 seconds of embarrassed silence and have the first question.
Do you get paid for endorsing Wing Commander?
I will really say this, and since I can gather from the recognition that it's a game that a lot of people now know, what impressed me about it, it's not the virtual reality, it isn't. But whereas we've all seen games where you sit there going bang, 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 and that's it, end of the alien. This is the first one where you get drawn into a plot, and there are other characters. And what happens to them depends on you. And it really just, there's one guy in it who's near retirement. And you fly out on a mission with him and you fight away and you do your best, and he gets shot. And you come back and you've completed the mission and you salute the commander and he tells you it's a shame about old Paladin, he was going to retire next month. And you think, I let him die, And you reload the game and you get out there. And you let yourself get shot to pieces as you fly behind this guy. Anyone comes near him, meanwhile you're being shot. You're not completely, but you get this guy back safely. That's weird. That's messing with your mind. But it's fun. And I found it. What was good when I used to work for the nuclear power station, I used to do most of my writing after we'd had a nuclear emergency. After I'd phoned up all the papers to tell them, no, it's absolutely no problems. A tiny amount of radioactivity has escaped you. You can't even see it, I would be so hyped up by, the adrenaline would be washing through me. I could then sit there and write all night. But after a really good go at Wing Commander, I'm so sort of tensed by the whole thing. It actually has wound up the motor again. I can sit there and write. And curiously enough, my wife pointed this out. I didn't believe it. But while I was playing the game, there was another game called Prince of Persia, which I was also very hot on playing. I actually was writing more. It was as if the day was somehow expanding to the next time. I was seemed to be playing games all the time. But in between, I would then go and do sort of 500 words, and then I would cool down a bit, and I would go and have another game. It's very strange, like the more time I was spending away from the computer writing, the more writing I was doing. Very strange indeed.
That's magic.
Yeah. time compression. You can do it with computers. Somebody else?
You have written good omens with new games.
Yeah.
How does the writing proceed by 2 authors?
You cannot democratically. For two people to do a book, you need one good-natured guy and one fascist bastard who will kick and scream and sulk until he gets his own way. How can I put this? I wasn't the nice one. And equally, I mean, ultimately I could turn to Neil and say, I've written other books, so I think it has to be done like this. There were one or two fights where neither of us would give in, and basically he quite liked killing people, I quite liked resurrecting them. But for most of the time, there was no contest. Because some person has to be in charge. You cannot let the thing wander all over the place and decide between you. It wasn't a case of me doing an outline and saying to him, flesh this out. We genuinely approached it together. But someone has to be the editor. And someone has to say, no, now we need a bit here, we need a bit there. And someone has to do all those bits, which neither of you want to do, but are actually necessary to turn it into a novel. All those little bits, the sole aim of which is to get character A to there, character C there, get, you know, these aren't really exciting bits, except that, you know, you actually, so I'd sit there and do those and suddenly find you could do things with them. It was enjoyable, it took us 9 weeks, and it was fun to do. We would not do it again because of all the things that happened since. Like, when it was being auctioned, there was the two of us, various publishers and 3 agents involved, and passion ran very high. Fortunately, Neil and I could stay friends, because if I got really annoyed, I could hit his agent. Take that, you bastard, boss! So it kind of worked. We have said that we will, although we have some ideas, I've got a whole Wandering Jew plot I want to use. We have some ideas for the sequel, which we've always said that was going to be called 668, The Neighbour of the Beast. we have said that basically we will do it when Eskimos walk around hell going, oh, it's a bit chilly down here. So, besides which we've got other things to do. It was a collaborative effort. It was done. It's gone out. We've sold a lot of copies, and probably that is it. I sacrificed a whole novel for it because Agnes Nutter, the witch, was basically would have been in the Discours book, and she got shoved in. And there's been, and the book I'm doing now, I mean, a lot of the theology of Good Omens was mine. I won't necessarily say it wasn't Neil's as well, but basically he agreed with it. Neil is great as an Old Testament scholar. He knows all the naughty bits of the Old Testament, the ones that people would prefer you not to read. So that was great. I actually had to read all the way through the Old Testament several times. God, I don't want to mess with this guy. But the 2 trees in the Garden of Eden. I didn't know there were 2 trees in the Garden of Eden. Because if you pick up your Bible, not because you read it, because you pick it up, you know, from comments and things, you think there's 1 tree. There's in fact 2 trees. And Adam and Eve were kicked out, not for disobeying God, but because he thought, hang on, if they're going to eat off that tree, they might eat off this tree, and if they eat off this tree, they'll become like me. You know, if they eat off the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which is not a bad thing, they might go and eat off the tree of life, which would be a bad thing. They were shut up. I thought, what bastard? You know, I mean, there's a Garden of Eden, there's a tree, you don't want people to eat it. There's 2 people on the entire planet, you know, and they live somewhere in the Middle East. So why don't you put the tree in Australia? Now, God don't eat it. So fancy saying that's like putting a big flashing sign, don't eat this tree, whatever you do, this is the tree, you mustn't eat this tree. Extremely weird. And I wanted to use the Isaac sacrificing his son gag. Because what God would like you to do, is tell you want to sacrifice your son. Right? So you think, I know this plot. Providing you show willing, at the last minute he says, okay, don't have to do it, you can sacrifice a goat instead. And I thought, I wonder how many people went up there and said, well, God, yes, we'll do that, right, okay, is there anything you want to tell me, God? You sure you're going to... Yeah. But we thought, no, that's going to get us too many enemies. One of the things we didn't do in Good Omens was mention Jesus Christ. This was very important. If we mentioned Jesus Christ, people would set fire to us. You can do what you like with God, but people get a bit worried about his prophets. So we kept away from the New Testament. Because the book of Revelation is not the New Testament. It's clearly a bit of Old Testament which wandered off and got lost. Somebody else. As you can gather, one question will probably keep me going for 5 minutes.
There's saying things about you don't like fluffy fantasy. Have you read R.A. Salvadore's Dark Elftree, or the first books and got the last one out yet?
I have to say, I don't read an awful lot of fantasy.
Because that actually goes into the politics of Dark Elf society, and it's not at all fluffy.
Well, there's a couple of things I have to say to expand this. One is one of the most helpful books that I've read. And I have to say, by the way, specifically, that I very much exclude Anne McCaffrey and all her works from this, because I loved her books. Because I've stolen things from them quite a few times. That's a mark of respect. Although some of her, shall we say, more enthusiastic fans have occasionally, if you will see when you read Guards, given me a little opportunity here and there. I read a superb book called Visions and Beliefs in the West of Ireland. Ireland being one of the places where, shall we say, some of the folklore of Western Europe tended to hang on longest. And there was a woman called Lady Gregory who used to go around hitting yokels on the head and saying, I will give you this shiny penny if you tell me any folk tales you know. And there was a very good summary of the approach of your basic, shall we say, peasant to the fair folk. You wanted to avoid them if you possibly could. You didn't want to hear them sing. You didn't want to be near them. You didn't want them to pay any attention to you. If you had any dealings with them, you just wanted to get out with a whole skin. As an aside, what fascinated me about that book, it's full of headless dogs and black horses and things. And then it mentions the puka. The puka is a spirit which sometimes appears as a dog or as a horse. Except on one occasion, and that was when I felt really chilled. Because as if in this book, which is full of the same old folk tales, there's one bit of genuine science fiction. One manifestation of the puka that appeared as something like a fleece, but made of but silvery, and it had floated about several inches above the ground. And as it moved over the ground, it took on the shape of the ground, and it made a sizzling, crackling noise. And this was amongst all these headless horses and dogs and things, and I thought, I just wonder if some guy coming back from digging the potatoes one night really did see something extremely weird, and where had it come from? And all he could think was the puka, because it's a moving spirit. But it actually certainly is a piece of kind of genuine reporting of a strange phenomenon that will turn up in this book. But you'd have to agree that there are a lot of fluffy elves, and there are a lot of fluffy dragons. And Americans said to me, your books won't do very well in the States because you cannot hear the elves sing. This is fine by me. I would like to put on my grey we had to design a fantasy city, and I have nothing whatsoever against Americans. I think they're a fine body of men if led by European officers. And provided you put a really big mark on the top of your tank, so they're not going to blow you up. They were the American fantasy writers were talking about battlements and silver towers and pennants and orders of chivalry. And I thought, there's 1 million people in this city. How does the fresh water get in? And how does the shit go out? and when I raised this point, the Americans levelled at me the worst thing Americans can say to a Briton: Benny Hill. But I said, no, this is where you will find your stories. The big concern, I mean, Peking, 250, 300 years ago had a population of 1 million. Think of Rome with a population of 1 million. What were the Romans concerned about? Aqueducts. How you get the water in and where you get the water from and what you do with the crap is important. And if you look at it in a fantasy way, there you will find your story. Who cares about the damn orders of chivalry? Who cares about the flags on the battlement? Real fantasy takes place down below. Real fantasy is the legs underneath that keeps the swan swimming. And you know, that's really how Ankh-Morpork got built.
Is that where you got luggage from as well?
Well, I don't know where the luggage came from. I genuinely don't know. How about this stage? Since I've been sitting here chatting to you for well more than an hour, I have a suspicion there's probably somebody else that should be happening. We're okay. Has anyone else got anything else they would like to? I don't like talking about the luggage that much. I mean, I don't know where the luggage came from. I know where death came from, that's easy. I know where my mother came from. But luggage worries me because I don't know how I created the luggage. So.
I don't mind telling you, I've been recording, hopefully getting the flavour of your talk, which I've found very enjoyable. The one thing which has always struck me about your books is that quite often you will be quite happily dealing with the events on Discworld, and you will say something as big as a double-decker bus or whatever, something completely out of context, and so I find it very amusing that you do this deliberately or just because you can't think of anything else.
No. Because as big as an 8-horse war chariot is not going to mean anything to you. See, no, it's not out of context because I know what the context is. The context is not a story unfolding on the Discworld. The context is you, the reader, in the 20th century, reading a story written by me. The Discworld doesn't know what a double-decker bus is, but you do. Everyone has to do this. I mean, do you get over here, do you get Red Dwarf yet?
What? Red Dwarf.
Red Dwarf? No? Okay, no, I won't mention it, but everyone has to face this kind of thing. If you're doing a fantasy world, I chose to face it by saying my readers know what the comparison is. I don't give a damn whether the characters in the books know, as long as they don't say it. A wizard can't say it's as big as a double-decker bus because he doesn't know what it is. But myself as the author can say. I remember describing magrat garlic. Now you haven't had weird systems here, have you? I think it's come.
The next one.
Yeah, and it's come to be called Macbeth.
Macbeth.
As having a chest. I mean, she has no bosom at all, and she's described as having a chest like an ironing board with 2 aspirins on it. Now, that's perfectly good for me to say as the author. No one on Discworld can possibly say that. And I take a lot of liberties like that, but it has to work. You cannot stay within context the whole time. Anything else? Anybody else?
You have written
the lady behind you.
Yeah, I wonder if you have ever heard anything of German fantasy, like Walter Boba, is that a something like this?
Not in any major way, no. Besides which, I have to say, almost as a matter of that there are now, as opposed to like 10 or 15 years ago, there's only a couple of fantasy writers I would regularly read. That's Peter Morwood and David Gemmell. And both of them write fantasy which is only peripherally fantasy. In other words, it's set in this world, but with a kind of, with the fantasy, as it were, round the edge. It's not dependent on the fantasy, and I prefer that. I don't read a lot of fantasy. I find it actually easier if I don't. If I like what I read, then I shall want to steal it. And if I don't like it, I'll have wasted my time. And I think that actually, a writer ought to read outside the field. Out there are billions of bad fantasy writers who do nothing but read fantasy. Now, if you read something else, read paleontology, read the history of the Old West, which is very, very relevant, because that is a fantasy world of its own, but it's a different fantasy world. Read geography, read the weird bits of history. Later on this weekend I'll talk about some of the weird bits of history I found, the bits you never get to hear about, like the Dutch tulip maybe and things like that. All these things, they're kind of grist to the mill, that they help the writer. But, you know, I think it's a bad thing to read too much in your own field. And you were saying, but we really have to. I saw what is being flourished. It'll be just like this one, only different.